Good evening and welcome to Bedtime, biographies where we relax to the stories of remarkable lives, all while drifting off to sleep. Tonight, we unravel the story of one of history's most paradoxical figures, a man whose face became the ultimate symbol of rebellion, plastered on dormitory walls from Berkeley to Beijing, and worn on t-shirts by people who have no idea what he stood for. He was a doctor who became a killer, a man who helped liberate Cuba, then left paradise to die in a Bolivian ditch. His enemies shot him in 1967, thinking they could bury the revolution with his body. Instead, they created an immortal Ernesto Guevara, known to the world simply as Che, became more powerful, dead than he'd ever been alive. Before we start, a quick note. Playing ads is what lets us keep bringing you new bedtime biographies every week. But we know you're here to relax, so we've limited them to just two. One before, Chapter 1, and one before, Chapter 2. After that, the rest of the story flows, uninterrupted. And if these quiet explorations help you unwind, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps other restless minds find these stories. Finally, let us know in the comments which historical figure should keep you company next time. Now, Che Guevara remains one of history's most divisive figures. But tonight we'll meet the human beneath the myth. We'll discover why 50 years after his death, the world still can't let him go. So settle in, let the day troubles fade, and allow yourself to drift along on this journey through a life that refused to be ordinary. This is the bedtime biography of Che Guevara. Chapter 1. The Secret Birth. The birth certificate was a lie. June 14th, 1928. It said stamped and signed with all the authority of the Argentine state. But baby Ernesto had actually arrived a month earlier on May the 14th, squalling into the world with a secret already wrapped around him. His mother, Celia, needed that lie desperately. 3 months pregnant at her wedding wasn't just embarrassing in 1920s Argentina. It was social suicide, the kind of scandal that could destroy a family's standing forever. So, a family friend, a doctor with flexible ethics and steady hands, adjusted the paperwork. One small fiction to protect a family's reputation, to keep the whispers at bay. Both parents came from aristocratic stock. Ernesto Guevara Lynch, the father, carried adventure in his bones and an imagination that stretched beyond reason. His great-grandfather had been one of South America's richest men, though that fortune had long since scattered. Celia de la Serna was true Argentine blue blood. One ancestor had ruled as Spanish royal viceroy of colonial Peru. So the newlyweds fled Buenos Aires and its wagging tongues. They headed for Misiones province, remote as anywhere. In Argentina, using Celia's inheritance, they carved out a yerba mate plantation from the jungle Puerto Caraguatay. They called their homestead here, among the howler monkeys and endless rain. No one asked questions about wedding dates. The local labor system turned Ernesto Sr.'s stomach. Workers called mensu lived trapped in debt. Bondage. Their wages stolen before they earned them. Through company store schemes and rigged accounting, most plantation owners loved the system, not Guevara Lynch. He insisted on paying his workers in actual cash, not company script. His neighbors thought him mad. This was the world that shaped the boy who would become Che. A world built on a lie that protected his mother's honor. A world where his father's wealth came from jungle soil. But his ethics rejected the cruelty that usually came with it. It was a madness his son would inherit, that rage against exploitation, that inability to look away from suffering. Chapter 2. The Asthmatic Daredevil. At age 2, a cold swim changed everything. His parents had taken him to the beach, and the water was colder than expected. The cough started that night. By morning, it had become something else entirely. The doctor's diagnosis landed like a punch: chronic asthma for life. The attacks would come without warning. His chest would tighten, his breathing turning into desperate gasps. Some nights his parents would find him sitting upright in bed fighting for air, his lips tinged blue. His illness ruled out any return to the damp climate of Mission and even their home in San Isidro, near the Rio de la Plata, proved too humid for him. On the advice of doctors, the Guevaras packed up and moved to Altera Gracia, a spa town famous for its dry climate. They lived in several houses there. Villa Chicha first, then Villa Nidia. Each move was another attempt to find the perfect spot, the magic combination of altitude and air that might let their son breathe easier. The town was full of other sick children, other desperate parents, tuberculosis, asthma, mysterious wasting diseases. Alteria was where you went when nowhere else could help. But here's the thing about Ernesto. The asthma might have pinned him to his bed for days at a time, might have turned him into a voracious reader who devoured everything from adventure novels to philosophy. But when he could stand, when his lungs allowed it, he transformed into something else. A daredevil, a maniac, a kid who seemed determined to dare death to take him. He joined the local gangs, the Barras, that ruled the streets of Alteria. They fought with stones and slingshots, defending their territories with the seriousness of real warriors. Ernesto, wheezing and skinny, threw himself into every battle. When other kids backed down, he pushed forward. When they hesitated at the edge of danger, he jumped. His stunts became legendary. He'd hang by his hands from railroad trestles while trains thundered. Overhead, he drank ink on a dare, ate chalk in class just to horrify his teachers. Once, knowing a strict teacher was about to spank him, he slipped a brick into his shorts. When her hand came down, she howled in pain. He took his punishment without flinching. The Guevara household itself was a kind of contained chaos. His mother, Celia, was a local scandal, one of the first women in Alta Gracia to drive a car, to wear trousers in public. The house overflowed with books, papers, unwashed dishes, and random children from every social class. They made friends with the golf caddies' kids, the servants' children, anyone interesting enough to hold a conversation. But behind the bohemian facade, the family was cracking. His parents fought constantly, terrible screaming matches that echoed through the house. Money was always tight, his father's schemes always falling through. And there were the women, always other women. Young Ernesto would flee into the countryside when the shouting started, disappearing for hours among the hills. Chapter 3. An emerging worldview. The Spanish Civil War exploded when Ernesto was 10, and it lit something inside him that would never go out. His family huddled around the radio every evening following the Republic's desperate fight against Franco's fascists. Young Ernesto didn't just listen. He got a map, spread it across the dining table, and marked the army's positions with colored flags, tracking every advance and retreat like a general studying his battlefield. The Guevaras were Republicans to their bones. When Franco's forces took another city, the house fell into mourning. When the Republic scored a rare victory, they celebrated like it was carnival. His father co-founded Acción Argentina, a gay group supporting the Allies against fascism. Ernesto joined the youth wing, though he was more interested in understanding the war than marching in protests. School bored him senseless. At the Colegio Nacional Dean Funes, he drifted through classes like a ghost, present in body but gone in spirit. His real education happened elsewhere, in the books he devoured and the notebooks he filled with his cramped handwriting. He made friends with the Grano brothers, Thomas and Alberto, who would become his companions in adventure. They called him El Pelo Baldi, mocking his unfashionable buzz cut on the rugby pitch. He transformed into someone else entirely. Here was Fusa, short for Elf Fury Bundo Kerner, the raging Cerner. Despite his asthma, he played with a violence that startled opponents. He'd charge into scrums, screaming his war cry, tackling players twice his size. Teammates learned to recognize the Y's that meant he was about to do something spectacular or stupid, often both. At 17, he started keeping what he called his philosophical notebooks, 7 volumes eventually filled with his thoughts on everyone from Freud to nature to Marx. He copied passages, argued with them, tried to build his own understanding of how the world worked. He even tackled Das Kapital, making careful notes in the margins of an abbreviated edition. though he'd later confess he hadn't understood a thing. But for all his reading, all his thinking, he wasn't an activist. Not yet. When his friend Alberto Grano got thrown in jail for protesting against the government, other students organized a march demanding his release. They asked Ernesto to join. He refused. It was a futile gesture. He told Alberto later he'd only march if someone gave him a revolver. Words without weapons were just noise. This was the young man taking shape in Alta Grazia, a walking contradiction, an asthmatic athlete, an aristocrat who befriended servants, an intellectual who trusted only action. He read about revolution but wouldn't join a protest. He studied Marx but didn't understand him. He was preparing for something, though he didn't know what yet. The world was teaching him its lessons, and he was taking notes, always taking notes. Chapter 4. The Motorcycle Diaries. In 1952, at age 23, Che climbed onto a leaky Norton 500 motorcycle named La Poderosa, the powerful one. He sat behind his friend, Alberto Grano, 29, and ready for adventure. They had grand plans to ride from Argentina to North America. The bike had other ideas. It would give out completely in southern Chile, but not before giving them the journey that would change everything. To survive, they became con artists of necessity. They told anyone who'd listen that they were leprology, experts traveling South America to study treatment centers. The lie worked better than they dreamed. Newspapers ran headlines about 2 Argentine experts in lepology travel South America. They'd show up at hospitals, nod seriously at equipment they didn't understand, and accept free meals from grateful directors. The journey was one disaster after another, each more ridiculous than the last. At a village dance in Chile, drunk on pisco and confidence, Che tried to lead a married woman outside. Her husband and his friends disagreed with this plan. The 2 Argentines ran through the night, stones flying past, their heads chase wheezing laughter, echoing through the darkness. But between the comedy came moments that stripped the laughter away. In the Atacama Desert, they met a communist miner and his wife shivering in the cold night. The couple had been blacklisted, marked as troublemakers for wanting decent wages. They moved from mine to mine, looking for work, finding only closed doors. Che gave them his blanket and lay awake, watching them huddle together. Here was the proletariat he'd read about, but they weren't abstractions in a book. They were freezing humans with names and faces. In Valparaiso, he found an old woman dying of asthma and heart disease in a filthy room. Her family had abandoned her, too poor or too exhausted to care. Che sat with her through the night, recognizing his own labored breathing in hers, seeing his possible future in her present. He wrote later about the tragedy that unfolds the lives of the proletariat throughout the whole world. But what he really meant was this woman, this room, this unbearable loneliness of dying poor. La Poderosa had given up in Chile, but they continued on foot, by truck, by boat, by any means possible. They worked on a freighter, tended lepers at San Pablo colony, got spectacularly drunk in Colombian bars, each mile stripped away another layer of the privileged Argentine medical student, revealing something raw underneath. By the time they reached Venezuela, Che was someone else. The person who'd started the trip had died somewhere along the way. He wrote, maybe in that freezing desert night, maybe in that dying woman's room, I am not the person I was before. The continent had educated him in ways no university could. He'd seen the bones of Latin America, the structure of suffering that held it all together. Chapter 5. A terrible shower of cold water. In 1953, Che headed for Guatemala like a moth to flame. President Jacobo Arbenzi was trying something impossible there. A social revolution through democratic means, land reform, labor rights, dignity for indigenous peoples. Che had to see it, had to understand if change could happen without bullets. He dragged along his friend Kalika Ferrer, who mostly wanted to chase girls and drink beer, but came anyway. Guatemala City throbbed with political exiles from across Latin America. Every cafe housed a different faction arguing about revolution over cheap coffee. Che found his people immediately. There was Hildegarda, a Peruvian exile, with Chinese ancestry and a mind sharp as broken glass. She worked for Arbenzi's government and knew everyone worth knowing. There were the Cubans, who'd survived Fidel Castro's suicidal attack on the Manada barracks, still bleeding from their defeat, but already planning the next round. The Argentine lawyer Ricardo Rojo showed up too, and they'd spend nights dissecting Latin America's problems like medical students over a corpse. But mostly Che watched Arbenz try to build his new Guatemala. Fascinated by this attempt to redistribute United Fruit Company land to peasants who'd worked it for generations, the American company owned more of Guatemala than Guatemala did. Arbenz wanted to change that. Then came June 1954. The CIA had been busy spending millions to paint Arbenz as a communist threat. They hired mercenaries, called them the Liberation Army. They flew planes over the capital, dropping propaganda, leaflets, and the occasional bomb. They broadcast lies on pirate radio stations. The psychological warfare was brilliant, making a few hundred mercenaries seem like thousands. Che tried to join the resistance, showing up at government offices, demanding a rifle. But Arb's people were paralyzed, torn between fighting and negotiating. The president refused to arm the people, afraid of civil war, still believing in rules and laws, while his enemies believed only in power. Che watched this fatal hesitation with growing disgust. Here was the revolution's crucial moment, and everyone was checking the constitution instead of checking their ammunition. The end came fast. The army turned against Arbenz, and he resigned rather than fight. He read his farewell speech on the radio while Che listened in rage. The president fled to the Mexican embassy. The land went back to United Fruit. The peasants went back to starving. Everything went back to how it was, except for the thousands who'd be tortured and killed for believing change was possible. Che called it a terrible shower of cold water. The phrase didn't capture his fury. He fled to Mexico with the lesson burned into his brain. Democracy was a luxury only the powerful could afford. Elections meant nothing if the losers had guns and the will to use them. Guatemala had shown him that revolution needed to be total violent, irreversible. You couldn't negotiate with empire. You had to destroy it completely, or it would destroy you. Chapter 6. A fateful meeting in Mexico. In July 1955, at Maria Antonio Gonzalez's apartment in Mexico City, Che met the man who would give his rage a purpose. Fidel Castro filled the room like smoke, talking with his hands, his voice, his whole body. He'd just gotten out of Cuban prison and was already planning to go back and overthrow Batista. The audacity was breathtaking. Che was hooked immediately. They talked through the night. Fidel, painting pictures of Cuba's corruption, its casinos and brothels serving American tourists, while peasants starved in the countryside. By dawn, Che had agreed to join as the expedition's doctor. It took Fidel 10 hours to recruit him. Later, Che would say, it should have taken 10 minutes. He'd been waiting for this moment since Guatemala fell. For the next year, Che trained with the Cuban rebels in Mexico. They practiced shooting at a firing range called Los Gamitos, learned guerrilla tactics from a Spanish Civil War veteran, hiked up volcano until their lungs burned. Fidel made Che a safe house leader, which irritated some Cubans. Who was this Argentine to give them orders? But Che's intensity, his willingness to push harder than anyone, gradually won respect. Life got complicated in August 1955. Hildegarda was pregnant with his child. They married because it was the decent thing to do, though Che's heart wasn't in it. Their daughter, Hilda Beatrice, arrived in February 1956. Che loved the baby, but felt trapped by domesticity. He was training for revolution while changing diapers. The contradiction ate at him. In June, Mexican police raided their training camp. Someone had talked, probably for money. Che spent 57 days in prison, and he made a crucial mistake. When interrogators asked about his politics, he told them the truth. Yes, he was a communist, Yes. He believed in armed revolution. Yes. He thought capitalism was doomed. Fidel was furious. He'd been carefully projecting a moderate image, talking about democracy and constitution. Now his Argentine doctor was scaring away potential allies with his honesty. But Fidel didn't cut him loose. Something about Che's purity, his inability to lie about what he believed, seemed to move the Cuban leader. Or maybe Fidel recognized a useful weapon when he saw one. Every revolution needs its true believers, its saints who die for the cause without hesitation. Che was already becoming that saint. On November the 25th, 1956, 82 rebels crowded aboard a yacht called the Grandma. It was built for 8 people. They sailed for Cuba anyway, everyone vomiting from seasickness. The boat taking on water, their supplies already soaked and spoiling. The journey was supposed to take 5 days. It took 7. They were supposed to land at night. They arrived in broad daylight in a pure mangrove swamp, already defeated before. They'd fired a shot. Chapter 7, Trial by Fire. In the Sierra Maestra, 3 days after landing, they walked straight into hell. The army was waiting at Alegria Deo, hidden in the sugarcane. The first shots sent the rebels scattering like startled birds. Che felt something punch his neck. Then warmth spreading down his chest. Blood. His blood. He dropped behind a tree and faced the moment every revolutionary imagines he was dying. Probably the revolution was dying. Definitely a box of ammunition sat to his left. A medical kit to his right. He could only carry one. The doctor in him reached for the bandages, then stopped. He grabbed the ammunition instead. Later, he'd call this the moment he truly became guerrilla. Medicine could wait. The revolution needed bullets. But first, he decided to die properly. He remembered a Jack London story about a man freezing to death with dignity in Alaska. If he was going to die, he'd do it like that. Character with some grace. Juan Almeida found him lying there, composing himself for death like an actor preparing for his big scene. Almeida wasn't interested in Che's theatrical exit. "Nobody's dying today," he said. "Get up and run." So Che ran, blood streaming down his neck through the sugarcane and into the jungle. Behind them, the army executed captured rebels. The revolution that was supposed to liberate Cuba had lasted exactly 3 days. The survivors stumbled through the Sierra Maestra like ghosts. Che called them an army of shadows, and that was generous. Of 82 men who'd sailed from Mexico, only 22 would ultimately regroup. They drank water from binocular eyepieces, licking the lenses for moisture. They ate raw corn stolen from peasant fields. They hid in caves during the day and moved at night, learning the mountains by starlight. Their salvation came through Celia, Sanchez's network of peasant supporters. She'd spent months preparing the mountains for their arrival, convincing farmers to hide food, store weapons, carry messages. Gumo Garcia led them through trails invisible to army. Patrols, slowly, painfully, they found each other. When Che's group finally reunited with Fidel, the maximum leader was furious. They'd lost their weapons. In Fidel's revolution, losing your rifle was worse than losing your life. But they were alive, barely, and the mountains would teach them how to fight. Every ravine became a classroom. Every peasant who'd been cheated by landlords became a potential recruit. Every army patrol that failed to find them built their legend. The government claimed they were all dead. Havana newspapers ran obituaries. Batista's generals celebrated with champagne. Meanwhile, high in the Sierra Maestra, 24 shadows were learning to become an army. Che's neck wound healed into a scar he'd carry forever. The revolution that everyone said had died was actually just being born in the hardest way possible, through blood and hunger and the kind of suffering that either breaks you or transforms you into something harder than the mountains themselves. Chapter 8, Forging a Comandante. The peasant guide seemed nervous that morning, sweating more than the climb. warranted. His name was Utimio Guerra, and he'd been leading rebels through the mountains for weeks. But something was off. Che noticed it first. That smell of betrayal that hung around a man about to sell his comrades. They found the proof in his pocket, an army safe. Conduct pass. Guerre had led them into an ambush once already. He wouldn't get another chance. The rebels held a trial right there, in the jungle. Guerre confessed everything, sobbing about his starving children, his desperation. The group stood in a meaty, uncomfortable circle, everyone knowing what had to happen, but nobody wanting to do it. Finally, Che said he'd end the uncomfortable situation. He put his pistol to Gar's head and pulled the trigger. The sound echoed through the mountains. The revolution had just learned how to kill its own. In February 1957, a miracle arrived in the form of Herbert Matthews from the New York Times. The journalist had hiked into the Sierra to see if the rebels were really alive. Fidel turned the interview into theater. He had the same fighters march past multiple times in different clothes, making his tiny force look like an army. He spoke of liberated territories that didn't exist, of victories that hadn't happened. Matthews believed it all. The articles changed everything. Suddenly, the dead rebels were alive and fighting. Money started flowing from sympathizers in Havana and Miami. Recruits began climbing into the mountains. Batista's government looked like liars or fools, probably both. The myth was becoming reality, or maybe reality was adjusting itself to match the myth. In guerrilla warfare, Che was learning the difference didn't matter. That July, Fidel called Che aside with news that would change his life. He was promoting him to commandante, the highest rank in the rebel army. Only Fidel himself held that title. Che would get his own column, his own star, to wear his own piece of the war to win or lose. The timing was perfect and vicious. Fidel announced Che's promotion the same day he demoted his own brother Raul for insubordination. Message received. Loyalty mattered more than blood. Che established his headquarters in the El Hombrito Valley and began building his vision of revolutionary life. He created a hospital where wounded fighters could recover, a bread oven that filled the camp with impossible smells, an armory where peasants learned to clean rifles. Most importantly, he started a newspaper, El Cubano Libre, teaching his illiterate soldiers to read, using articles about their own revolution. This was Che becoming himself, the warrior philosopher who could execute a traitor at dawn and teach literacy at noon. He wasn't just fighting to destroy Batista's regime. He was building the new world that would replace it. One bread, oven, and reading lesson at a key time. The asthmatic Argentine doctor had transformed into something harder and stranger. A commandante who believed revolution meant changing everything, especially yourself. Chapter 9. The Battle of Santa Clara. In August 1958, Fidel gave Che an impossible order. Take your column out of the mountains and march across Cuba to Las Vas province. Cut the island in half. The 6-week march through swamps and open plains turned his men into walking skeletons. They ate their horses, then their leather belts, then nothing. Government planes strafed them. During the day, mosquitoes ate them. Alive at night, Che called them an army of shadows again. But this time, the shadows were winning. Santa Clara waited at the end of their march, the provincial capital, with 150,000 people and 500 soldiers. Che had 340 rebels, most of them peasants, who'd learned to shoot in the mountains. The mathematics were insane, but Batista's army was rotting from the inside, and Che could smell it. Soldiers who fought for paychecks would always lose to men who fought for tomorrow. The key to the city was an armored train. Batista had sent as reinforcement 22 cars loaded with weapons, ammunition, and 350 soldiers. It sat on the tracks like a metal dragon, supposedly invincible. Che studied it through his binoculars and saw a coffin on wheels. He ordered his men to get a bulldozer from the university. They'd tear up the tracks and let physics do the rest. On December 29th, the trap was ready. The train came thundering toward the city and hit the broken rails at full speed. Cars jackknifed and derailed, smashing into each other like dominoes made of steel. Che's rebels attacked with Molotov cocktails, turning the armored cars into ovens. The soldiers inside faced a choice between burning alive or surrendering. They chose surrender, streaming out with their hands up while the rebels couldn't believe their luck. The train's fall broke Santa Clara's will to fight. Soldiers started deserting by the platoon. The police chief switched sides. Even the local mob boss offered to help. Che kept pushing, leading from the front despite fracturing his elbow. Falling from a wall, his arm hung useless in a sling, but his voice never stopped, coordinating attacks on the police station, the jail, the provincial palace. By New Year's Eve, Batista understood what everyone else already knew. The war was over. He packed his bags with stolen millions and fled to the Dominican Republic at 3:00 in the morning, leaving Cuba like a thief. The news reached Santa Clara at dawn. Che had taken the city. The revolution had won. The impossible had happened. In the central plaza, rebels fired their rifles into the air while people poured into the streets. Che stood watching, his broken arm throbbing, already thinking about what came next. Taking power was one thing. Building a new world was another. The real revolution, the one that happened inside people's heads, hadn't even started yet. Chapter 10. The Supreme Prosecutor of La Cabana. When Che arrived in Havana, Fidel gave him La Cabana Fortress, not the camp. Colombia Military Headquarters, which went to the charming Camilo Cienfuegos. Che got the old stone fortress where Spain used to execute rebels because Fidel understood typecasting. The revolution needed someone to clean house, to be the cold face of revolutionary justice. Che was perfect for the part. As supreme prosecutor, he oversaw the trials that would define the revolution's first months. Every night, the fortress filled with alleged war criminals, torturers who'd pulled fingernails for Batista, informers who'd sold their neighbors for 20 pesos. Che delegated the actual trials to men like Miguel Angel Duque de Estrada, but he kept the final word on death sentences. The power of life and death reduced to his signature on a document. The trials were revolutionary theater, quick and brutal. Evidence was presented, usually testimony from victims or their families. The accused could speak, though it rarely helped. Then came the verdict. Almost always guilty, almost always death. Che would review the proceedings in his office, smoking a cigar, making notes in the margins. If he signed, the condemned died that night against the fortress wall. The executions happened after midnight. The condemned would be led to the wall, offered a blindfold and a priest, though most refused both. Then the rifles would crack and another enemy of the revolution would crumple to the ground. By dawn, hundreds had died this way. The fortress walls became a monument to revolutionary justice or revolutionary vengeance, depending on who was telling the story. Che insisted this was necessary. The lesson Guatemala had taught him. Arbenz had shown mercy to his enemies, and they destroyed him. The revolution couldn't afford such weakness. Every executed torturer was a future coup that wouldn't happen. Every dead informer was a CIA plot that couldn't take root. This was prevention, disguised as punishment, surgery, pretending to be justice. His father visited from Argentina, disturbed by what his son had become. "You studied medicine to save lives," the old man said. "Now you're ending them." Che laughed at that, a hard sound, without humor. He told his father he could hang up a shingle back home, advertising a new kind of practice. "Come to Guevara, where we kill people without any medical risk." The joke hung between them like a corpse. His actions followed him everywhere now. He signed papers in his office while others did the shooting. But everyone understood that his signature was the real weapon. His pen killed more enemies of the revolution than his rifle ever had. He'd become what the revolution needed. The man who could do necessary things without flinching. Who could sign death warrants between sips of Métis tea. Chapter 11. Building the new man. They made him president of the National Bank, which was Fidel's idea of a joke. Che knew nothing about banking except that he hated banks. When he signed the new peso notes, he scrolled, just Che, instead of his full name like a graffiti artist tagging currency. Every bill that passed through Cuban hands carried his mockery of monetary authority. Later, they gave him the Ministry of Car Industries, too. The guerrilla fighter was now running the economy he'd come to destroy. But Che had bigger plans than sugar, quotas and production targets. He wanted to build the new man, the communist human who would work for love, not money. Material incentives were capitalist poison, he insisted. Soviet-style bonuses and rewards just created socialist greed. The true revolutionary worked 16-hour days because the work itself was the reward. He transcended selfishness, dissolved his ego into the collective, become a piece of the revolution's machinery. He practiced what he preached with the fervor of a monk. He lived on his tiny commandant salary, refusing the mansions and cars other revolutionary leaders grabbed. When his deputy Orlando Barago showed up in a Jaguar sports car, Che made him return it immediately. That's not how revolutionaries live. He said, "We're examples, not exceptions." Burgo later said working for Che was like working for Jesus Christ. If Jesus had been armed and angry, the Soviet advisors thought he was insane. They'd been building socialism for 40 years with production bonuses and penalty systems. Now, this Argentine doctor was telling them they'd been doing it wrong. During one meeting, Che told a room full of Soviet economists that their system was doomed. "You're just creating state capitalism," he said. "In 50 years, you'll be back where you started." The room went silent. Nobody criticized the Soviets, especially not while taking their oil and weapons. He told friends the Soviet Union was anti pigsty, a betrayal of everything Marx had imagined. They'd replaced Wall Street with the Kremlin, but kept the same rotten heart. The belief that people only worked for personal gain. The Soviets were building socialism with capitalist tools, like trying to perform surgery with a machine gun. It could work technically, but the patient wouldn't survive. For officials who didn't meet his standards, he created a rehabilitation camp at Guanacabibs. Not a prison, exactly, but a place where bureaucrats, guilty of laziness or corruption, could rediscover their revolutionary spirit through hard labor. Cut sugarcane for a city. Few months. And remember why the revolution happened. Some called it cruel. Che called it medicine. He was trying to transform human nature itself to prove that people could be more than elfish animals scrambling for advantage. Every policy, every speech, every punishment was part of this grand experiment. Could you build a society where people worked for each other instead of themselves? Could you create humans who'd forgotten how to count their money? Che believed you could. Had to believe it because otherwise the revolution was just changing the color of the flag while everything else stayed the same. Chapter 12. The Long Goodbye. By 1964, Che felt like a tiger in a cage made of paperwork. He was drowning in production, reports and trade agreements while his hands itched for a rifle. The revolution had won, and winning was killing him. He'd become what he'd never wanted to be, a bureaucrat with a gun permit. Every morning he faced the same desk, the same problems, the same feeling that history was happening somewhere else without him. His plan to spread revolution to Argentina collapsed before it started. He trained his protégé, Jorge Ricardo. Métis sent him south with weapons and hope. The mission lasted a few months before the Argentine military destroyed it completely. Métis vanished into the jungle, probably dead, certainly defeated. Che read the reports in his office, each failure a personal accusation. He was sending others to die for dreams. He should be chasing himself. Then came February 1965. In Alès, Che stood before an audience of African revolutionaries and lit a match under his own feet. He denounced the socialist countries for their tacit complicity with imperialist exploitation. The Soviets were no better than the Americans, he said, using aid as chains, turning liberation movements into puppet shows. The audience loved it. Moscow was furious. Fidel was trapped between his most famous revolutionary and his only source of oil. He returned to Cuba on March 15th and disappeared like smoke. no explanation, no public farewell. Just absence where Che used to be. Rumors flew through. Havana, he was dead. He was in an insane asylum. Fidel had killed him. The CIA had killed him. He'd killed himself. The truth was simpler and stranger. He was in a safe house, growing a new face, becoming someone else entirely. On October the 3rd, Fidel read Che's farewell letter on television. The whole country stopped to listen. Che renounced everything. His Cuban citizenship, his government positions, his rank of commandante. Other nations of the world call for my modest efforts. He wrote, the most difficult hours await me. He was leaving to fight where he was needed, wherever that might be. The letter was his divorce from Cuba, from safety, from any future that didn't involve dying for the revolution. He left letters for his parents. 2. Trying to explain the unexplainable. 4. His 5 children, each got a note, calibrated to their age. Be good, revolutionaries. Study hard. Remember, your father loved you. For his wife, a leader. He recorded himself reading love poems onto tape, his voice cracking occasionally. These were the sounds of a man saying goodbye to everything, burning his bridges while standing on them. He'd already left Cuba secretly, heading for Africa with a fake passport and a mission that made no sense to anyone but him. He had to prove the new man could exist by becoming him completely. No safety net, no retreat, no life except revolution. He was 36 years old and starting over. The eternal guerrilla who couldn't stop fighting because stopping meant admitting the dream was just a dream. Chapter 13. Failure in the Congo. In April 1965, Che arrived at Lake Tangana looking like someone else entirely. Clean, shaven, wearing fake glasses, and a disguise that made him unrecognizable. He called himself Tatu Swahili for 3 because he was starting his 3rd war. The Congo would be his masterpiece, the spark that would set Africa burning with revolution. Instead, it became his classroom in catastrophe. The Congolese rebels he'd come to lead were barely an army. They believed in magic water that made bullets bounce off skin. Before battles, the witch doctor would sprinkle fighters with the potion, declaring them invulnerable when they died anyway, which happened constantly. The witch doctor explained they hadn't believed hard enough. Che watched this theater with growing despair. How could you build scientific socialism with soldiers who thought revolution was witchcraft? Their leader, Laurent Kabila, was worse than absent. He spent his time in Cairo, hotels, drinking whiskey and making promises he'd never keep. When he did appear, it was to demand more Cuban supplies before vanishing again. The rebels weren't fighting for socialism or liberation. They were fighting for whatever Kabila promised them that week, usually loot from captured towns. Che called them a parasitic army, which was generous. Parasites at least know what they're doing. The Cuban force itself was falling apart. Soldiers who'd been heroes in the Sierra Maestra became ghosts in the Congo. They caught tropical diseases that ate them from inside. They shot at shadows and ran from real fights. Some begged to go home. Others stopped, talking entirely, staring at the jungle like it might swallow them whole. Which it might. Everything in the Congo wanted to kill you, from the mosquitoes to the mercenaries. Then came the letter from Argentina. His mother, Celia, was dead. Cancer, finally winning its long war. Che read the news by candlelight in his tent, 10,000 meters from her funeral. He couldn't even mourn properly. Surrounded by soldiers who needed him to be steel, not flesh, he poured his grief into his diary, writing about failure and death, about revolutions that existed only in his imagination. The end came in November, 7 months after it began. The Congolese government forces, backed by white mercenaries and American weapons, were closing in. The rebellion collapsed like wet paper. Che ordered his Cubans to retreat across Lake Tangana, a midnight evacuation that felt like running away. Some Congolese fighters tried to come with them. There wasn't room. They had to be left behind. Another betrayal to add to his collection. Later, hiding in Prague, Che wrote his account of the mission. He called it Page de la Guerra, Revolucionaria Congo, and began with brutal honesty. This is the story of a failure. Every page that followed explained how revolution could die from 1,000 small sereners. The Congo had taught him that will alone wasn't enough. You needed the right conditions, the right people, the right moment. He'd had none of them. Chapter 14. The final campaign. Bolivia. From his hiding place in Prague, Che stared at maps of Latin America like a chess player planning his last game. Bolivia jumped out at him, the heart of the continent, touching 5 other countries, perfect for spreading revolution like a virus. In November, 1966, he arrived in La Paz, disguised as a doulo, Mena Gonzalez, a balding Uruguayan economist with thick glasses and a forgettable face. The customs officer barely looked up. The problem started immediately. He'd expected Mario Mon, leader of Bolivia's Communist Party, to provide fighters and support. On New Year's Eve, Mon showed up at Che's camp with an ultimatum instead. Either he commanded the revolution, or he'd withdraw all support. Che told him to go to hell. Politely, Mon left and took the urban networks with him. The revolution was orphaned before it could crawl. The peasants were supposed to join them, these descendants of exploited Indians who'd suffered for centuries. Instead, they ran when the guerrillas approached. They had just gotten land from the government's reform program. Why risk it for strangers speaking bad Spanish with foreign accents? When captured peasants promised support, they disappear the moment they were released and report straight to the army. Every friendly face was potentially a death sentence. Che's radio contact with Havana went dead in January and never came back. They were alone in hostile mountains, with no supplies, no reinforcements, no escape route. His asthma returned with vengeance, leaving him gasping through marches while trying to look strong for his men. The medicine ran low, then ran out. He'd wheeze orders between attacks, his body betraying him when he needed it most. The Bolivian army had help. American special forces trained them in counterinsurgency, teaching them to think like guerrillas, to kill guerrillas. CIA advisors studied every mistake Che had made in the Congo, turning his own experience against him. Rangers hunted his band through the mountains, patient as wolves. They knew time was their weapon. Every day made the guerrillas weaker, hungrier, more desperate. In August, disaster. The army ambushed his rear guard at the Masakuri River. 8 dead, including Tanya Bonka, the only woman in their group. She'd been his courier, his connection to the outside world. They found her body downstream, bloated beyond recognition. Che wrote in his diary that she died doing what she believed in, but the words felt hollow. She died because he'd led her here to die. By October, there were 17 starving men stumbling through hostile mountains. The peasants they'd come to liberate were helping the army track them. His Bolivian fighters were deserting or dying. The Cubans were breaking down, seeing death in every ravine. Che knew how this story ended. He had written it himself in the Congo, just with different names. Revolution without conditions for revolution was just elaborate suicide. But he kept walking anyway because stopping meant admitting he'd been wrong about everything. Chapter 15. Execution and Resurrection. October 8th, 1967. The Quirada de Luro ravine was supposed to be their escape route. Instead, it became a trap with walls of stone. The rangers appeared on the ridges above, like they'd been waiting forever. Che's M2 carbine took a bullet that destroyed it completely, leaving him with a useless piece of metal. Shrapnel tore into his leg. He tried to run, but the earth itself seemed to grab him. When Sergeant Bernardino found him, Che said the words that would echo through history. Don't shoot. I'm Che Guevara. I'm worth more to you alive than dead. They dragged him to La Higua, a nothing village with a one-room schoolhouse. That would become famous for what happened inside it. Captain Gary Prow couldn't believe they'd actually caught him. This mythical figure looked like a broken vagrant, filthy, wounded, deflated. Che told Prow simply that he'd failed, that it was all over. The revolution that was supposed to set South America ablaze had ended in a dusty classroom with bullet holes in the walls. Felix Rodriguez arrived the next morning, a Cuban exile, working for the CIA. He had a camera and orders from Langley to keep Che alive for interrogation. But the Bolivian High Command had different plans. President Barrientos wanted the problem to disappear. No trial, no speeches, no chance for Che to become a living symbol. Rodriguez got on the radio and heard the code words 500, 600. Che would die at 110 that afternoon. They sent Sergeant Mario Terran to do it, but he couldn't at first. He stood in the doorway, rifle shaking, staring at this man who terrified governments. Che told him to shoot, that he was only killing a man. Thran left and had to be ordered back. The second time he drank for courage. At 110 exactly, he fired a gun. Burst into Che's chest. The heroic gorilla crumpled against the dirt floor, his eyes still open, still seeing something nobody else could see. They strapped his body to a helicopter, skid and flew it to Valle Grande, displaying it on a concrete laundry sink. In the hospital, photographers noticed how he looked like Christ in those Renaissance paintings, wounded and sacrificial. The same soldiers who'd hunted him now reached out to touch his hair like he might pass on some power. Nuns snipped locks for keepsakes. Everyone seemed to understand they were looking at something larger than a dead revolutionary. The military amputated his hands for fingerprints, proof for the world that Che was really dead. Then they buried him secretly near the airstrip. No marker, no ceremony, nothing to become a shrine. For 30 years, he stayed hidden in that unmarked grave. But in July 1997, his skeleton was found and returned to Cuba in a carnival of state ceremony. They tried to disappear him, but absence had only made him stronger. Someone spray painted the truth on a wall in Val Grande. Che, alive as they never wanted you to be. Death had done what life couldn't, transforming a failed revolutionary into an eternal symbol, a face on 10 million t-shirts, a dream that couldn't be killed because it was already dead, already perfect, already beyond the reach of failure or compromise or anything as mundane as reality. Epilogue. The immortal rebel. They buried Che in 1967, but he wouldn't stay dead. Within months of his execution, his face was everywhere, staring from posters in Paris dormitories where students were building barricades against police. May 1968, and French revolutionaries who'd never touched a rifle carried his image through tear gas and broken glass. In Berkeley, in Mexico City, in Tokyo, young people who couldn't pronounce his name correctly wore his face like armor against the world their parents had built. Alberto Corder's photograph did most of the work. That picture from 1960, Che at a funeral looking past the camera towards some impossible horizon. Corder never copyrighted it, said the revolution shouldn't be commodified, so it spread like wildfire, reproduced endlessly, each copy making him more myth than man. The image became the most reproduced photograph in history, which would have amused Che, who hated nothing more than personality cults. The capitalists he died fighting turned him into their best-selling product. By the 1990s, you could buy Che vodka, Che cigarettes, Che bikinis. Madonna wore him on her chest. Models strutted down runways in designer Che wear that cost more than Cuban workers made in a year. The supreme irony that would have made him laugh or cry, or maybe both. Revolution as fashion statement. Rebellion you could purchase with a credit card. But something else was happening too, something harder to dismiss. In the mountains of Chiapas, Zapatista rebels carried his picture next to Zapatas, twin saints of indigenous revolution. In Colombia, the FARC quoted his manuals while fighting their endless war. In Palestine, fighters wore charshirts under their combat vests. He'd become the patron saint of anyone who picked up a gun against power, whether he would have approved or not. Castro turned him into Cuba's secular Christ, building monuments and museums, naming schools and hospitals after him. Every Cuban child learned to chant, Serios co elch, we will be like. But they meant a Yui. sanitized version, cleaned up for state consumption. The Che who never questioned Fidel, who never criticized the Soviet Union, who died conveniently, far from Cuba, where he couldn't complicate things with his impossible standards. In Bolivia, where they'd killed him, something stranger happened. The same peasants who'd betrayed him to the army started praying to Saint Ernesto of La Higua. They lit candles where he died, asked him to cure sick children, to bring rain for crops. The Catholic Church condemned it, but rural Bolivians didn't care. They turned their executioner's victim into their protector. History's darkest joke. Scholars wrote thousands of books trying to explain him. Marxist theoreticians analyzed his economics, usually concluding he'd been naive about human nature. Military historians studied his guerrilla tactics, noting all the mistakes. Psychologists diagnosed him posthumously with everything from narcissism to Christ complex. Everyone had a theory about why he'd failed, but nobody could explain why he wouldn't disappear. Because here's what survived beyond the bullets and the books and the boutique. Revolution merchandise. The idea that someone born into comfort could choose discomfort for principle. That a doctor could become a killer for kindness. That failure might be more honorable than success if you failed attempting this impossible. Every generation since his death had discovered him a new finding. In that frozen face, whatever they needed. To find hope, usually, or permission to hope, which amounts to the same thing. 50 years after they shot him in that schoolhouse, Che had become exactly what he'd never wanted to be and everything he'd always been. A symbol emptied of specific meaning, filled with whatever meaning people required. The teenager in Tehran, wearing his face, didn't know he'd executed deserters. The banker in London, with Che coffee mugs, didn't know he'd banned Soviet bonuses. They knew only the outline, the shadow, the beautiful corpse who died trying to change the world. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how revolutions really work. Not through victory, but through the stories victories leave behind. Che had wanted to create the new man through will and sacrifice. Instead, he'd become him, frozen at 39. Forever young, forever pure, forever about to win the revolution that would never come. The asthmatic boy from Argentina had found the only cure for his condition. He'd stopped breathing altogether and started living everywhere, in every raised fist and desperate dream, alive as they never wanted him to be.